This is my first attempt trying to take some of our early results and put them into one story. So we'll see how it goes, and I'm interested in your feedback towards the end. I want to start off by talking about recreational fisheries landscapes. This is a term that I think we might have made up, and so I'm going to define it so you know what I'm talking about, and it's a term I'm going to use a lot throughout the talk. And so these are some of the key components of a recreational fishery landscape. There are a bunch of water bodies here, all over this landscape. There are some fish in those water bodies. There are anglers who move around between those water bodies looking for things to catch. And then there are some institutions of various kinds, and those might be fairly formal institutions like a natural resource management agency, or much more informal institutions, sort of rules that people have of common use of resources, things like that. So those are the key components of any recreational fisheries landscape. And the recreational fisheries landscape that I'm going to talk about most today, or at least use as sort of a case study, is this one in northern Wisconsin, where that picture is from, right on the border of northern Wisconsin and Michigan. This is the area where the North Temperate Lakes LTER has been working for a long time. There's been a lot of great work on the ecology of the lakes, and also on some of the fisheries and sort of social-ecological dynamics of those lakes as well. So there's sort of a rich history for us to build on in doing this research. So that's the particular landscape that's going to be in my mind a lot, and where the data will come from that I'll show for the most part. But these kinds of landscapes happen all over the world, right? And here are some points on a map of some of them that I kind of know a little bit about, and some pictures of a few of them. And you can see from the pictures that these recreational fisheries landscapes are in some ways really different. So they have really different biophysical settings. These are lakes in northern Sweden. Here are rivers out west. Really different social settings, right? There are different norms and rules and institutions built up around fisheries in different parts of the world, particularly from country to country or continent to continent, but even within a country. And different fish species and all that stuff. But they all share in common the fact that they have multiple fishing opportunities available to a pool of anglers who are going to move around between those fishing opportunities. Okay, I'm talking today only about recreational fisheries. And in some ways, that's a weird thing to do because recreational fisheries are for fun, and so why am I spending time up in my ivory tower thinking about them? I guess I'll say partly because they're interesting, partly because they're actually quite important. In North America, for sure, they're the major component of the whole freshwater fisheries sector. So commercial fisheries, subsistence fisheries are not a big deal really in North America and in lots of parts of Europe. And instead, it's recreational fisheries that really drive the bus. So here's a picture sort of giving you that idea. There's lots of different kinds of anglers fishing for lots of different kinds of things in North American recreational fisheries. There are about 30 million people in the United States who go fishing every year. That's 10% of our population. They spend about 450 million angler days on the water, so 15 days per person or something like that on average. And the direct expenditures on recreational fishing are in the neighborhood of $25 billion a year. So, it's a fairly big deal. Despite that importance of recreational fisheries, or maybe because of it being such a popular activity, we see evidence that those recreational fisheries in inland waters are in as bad shape or worse shape than some of the sort of famous collapses of marine fisheries that you've probably heard about. And this is a picture from a paper a number of years back now that I really like as a way to illustrate that point. So this girl here helping to hold up this big long stringer of walleye is the mother or grandmother of one of the authors of this paper back in the 40s or something like that. And she's standing at the cabin, the guide service that her family runs and has run for generations somewhere in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or something like that, one of the prairie provinces. And so at the time that this girl was a girl, the family ran a very successful guide business leading people on trips for walleye. It was a great walleye fishery. The backstory to that is that actually when her grandfather was around, the family had run a guide service at the same lake, at the same place, that was focused on lake trout. And over the years, over the generations, that lake trout fishery eventually collapsed. And so that was kind of bad news for the family, but they switched over to walleye, and so now they're running a very successful walleye business, and that's fine. By the time the co-author of the paper was a kid, the walleye fishery had pretty much collapsed. And yeah, that was bad, but it was kind of okay because now the family's leading a very successful guide business focused on northern pike. And actually, by the time the paper gets written, there's starting to be signs that the northern pike fishery is sort of on the way down, right? And so if you have a 5-generation-long perspective or whatever on that fishery, you get the sense that something's not going very well. But if you don't have that 5-generation-long perspective, then all you see is that, hey, there's great fishing here. You know, we can go there and catch trophy northern pike or whatever it is, right? And so John Post and his co-authors talked about this as sort of an invisible collapse of recreational fisheries in Canada. And to some extent, we know that the same thing happens in the United States. In both Canada and the United States, the data really to nail this down are pretty limited. There's not a lot of data about recreational fisheries. There are not great long-term records on most recreational fisheries, and so it's not a thing that we can really pin down very well with data, but the reviews that have tried to tackle this have come to this conclusion that, you know, the data aren't really there, but there seems to be a general belief that the fishing quality in North America has declined. Okay, so why are these landscapes so difficult to govern, so difficult to manage well and sustainably? Why are they vulnerable to collapse? Here are a few of what we think are some of the key reasons, and I'm going to kind of rattle through these. There's a lot of systems, right? So you look at a landscape like this, there's a lot of water out there. Northern Wisconsin is an extreme for that. There's an awful lot of lakes, but you could go to farm ponds in Alabama, and there's a lot of places somebody can choose to go fishing. Each one of those systems has fairly complex dynamics. So the fish and fishery dynamics are complex. The dynamics of people interacting with that system are complex. And so they're not easy to understand well, they're not easy to get good data about. And to make that worse, they're not actually independent, right? So you've got a bunch of complex systems that are being linked by people as sort of a mobile predator who move around between the systems, but as a result, they're linking the dynamics of those separate systems together, right? Those human decisions are made often with information that is not accurate. So I'll talk later on in the talk about how people make decisions about where to go fishing, and we know that often those decisions are sort of misguided or not actually informed by accurate data, and so it's hard to make good decisions when you have bad data. This is a perennial problem for fisheries management agencies across North America. It's a lot of work to do, and the budgets are not big, and they're getting smaller. And so these agencies are trying to find ways to steward the resources as they're charged with doing, with really a pretty big challenge and not very many resources. And to top it all off, these are open access resources, right? Anybody can buy a license for a nominal fee and go fishing. And so they're subject to sort of tragedy of the common problems. Okay, a way to sum that all up is to say these are complex social ecological systems. They have open access to a common pool resource. And so that makes them hard to manage or to govern well. Okay, so I was putting this talk together, and I felt like I had said things like vulnerable and collapse and like doom and gloom for kind of a while. It's shorter when you actually talk through it, but I felt like I needed to kind of break it up a little bit. So we've got some rainbows and some kittens. Those are both nice things. But you know, there's actually a point there, which is that you know, you can kind of take that as a doom and gloom message. These fisheries are maybe not in as good condition as they could be, and they're difficult to put in a good condition or keep in a good condition. But I think there's some hope, and one of the things we're trying to do in this project we're working on right now is to try to do a better job of understanding those systems as coupled social-ecological systems, and therefore to be able to identify some of the pathways and the obstacles along those pathways to being able to manage those systems well and resiliently. Okay, so what I want to do for the rest of the time I have today is to talk about some of the work that we're doing along those lines. And I'm going to start you off on this hideously ugly figure that gives a little bit of an overview of some of the key social, ecological, and social ecological dynamics in this system, we think. And so I'll start over here maybe in sort of the ecological system and say that we're going to talk a lot about fish, which is maybe not surprising, and then a couple processes that affect the abundance of fish. One is recruitment, so that's addition of new fish to the population. The other is angling, and that's by and large subtraction of fish from the population. And we think that both of those processes are mediated by habitat. So habitat provides a refuge for fish that can improve recruitment. So if you're a little fish, it helps you to survive and get to be a big fish. That habitat can also aggregate adult fish, and that can actually make it easier for anglers to target adult fish, right? So habitat has these complex effects on fisheries dynamics. Let's see. Those ecological processes are linked in a few ways to social processes. One of the most important ways that those things are linked is by catch, right? So anglers are basically sampling from the ecological system by fishing. They get information about that system and they make decisions based on that information. And so the catch process is a process that links from what's going on ecologically to what the social system does about it. There's also a bunch of things about the biophysical setting of a particular water body, a lake or a stream or whatever, that influence where people decide to go fishing, how social systems are constructed around those ecological systems, things like that. Okay, in the social system, we're going to think a lot about anglers and how they make decisions about where to go, how they gather some of this catch information and exchange it, and then also how all of those kind of angling processes interact with some of the governance, the management of the lake or of the fisheries. And in particular, we're going to talk a lot about lake associations, which are sort of volunteer organizations that help to manage lakes without any formal power. And we're going to be thinking about some of the investment decisions that those lake associations make back into the ecological system. So here you go. Here are those investments in stocking and habitat. And then, of course, probably the most important link from the social system to the ecological system is where effort goes in the landscape. Okay, that's big and ugly. What I'm going to do is take sort of a few different slices through that set of ideas and give you a few vignettes of some of the work we're trying to do about those different ideas. And the first vignette doesn't have a very good title. It's Houses, Wood, Mortality, Stocking, and Taxes. So we're going to be thinking about people building houses along lakes, what that does to a kind of habitat, which is coarse woody habitat down to trees that are in the lake, what that does to mortality rates of juvenile fish, how that relates to stocking, and ultimately to sort of tax policy, I guess. I shortened that title a little bit, and we can just think of it as death and taxes, if you like. Okay, so one of the sort of general principles in lake and stream, I suppose, fisheries, is that when people develop along water bodies, they take wood out. Okay, so here's a figure from work by Christensen and also reproduced by Schindler, showing how dense the housing is along a lake, from not very many houses to a lot of houses per kilometer, and therefore how many pieces of downed coarse woody habitat, coarse woody debris, big trees in the water you find. And there's a really sharp decline, obviously. At low housing density, you often have quite high woody habitat. It can be variable. But as you go to higher housing density, people yank those trees out. They get in the way of getting your boat in there. They get in the way of the grandkids using the beach, et cetera, et cetera. People pull those trees out so they can access their shorelines. One of the reasons that that's important is that there's sort of this theorem or axiom. It's not actually, I think, called anywhere the first law of fisheries. I just named it that. That woody habitat is habitat for little fish and therefore protects them from being eaten by big fish. Okay? And so if you look at basically any model of an inland fishery system that's interested in angler and fishery dynamics, almost always there'll be some mechanism in that model that talks about how woody habitat or some similar kind of habitat affects mortality rates, survival rates of young fish. Okay, it's sort of like a given in fisheries. Okay, so it's a bad thing that people are moving the wood out of the lakes. Jake Ziegler, who was a PhD student with me at McGill, got interested in this idea and borrowed some models from our collaborator, Brett Van Porten, to think about, okay, well, so if wood is habitat that helps to protect little fish from getting eaten, then if you take the wood out and the little fish get eaten and the population goes down, does that basically drive a demand for stocking of fishes? And so he put together a model. It's got some sort of simple fish population dynamics in it, and it's got some coarse woody habitat that affects the mortality rates of yoi, that's young of year fish, baby fish. There are lakefront property owners. They often remove the wood. And there are also anglers of various kinds, including the property owners and other people who are coming to visit the lake. They take fish out of the population, and then based on their harvest, they end up either satisfied or dissatisfied. And when they're dissatisfied, they tell their managers about it. If you're dissatisfied with your fishing, actually, here in central New York, some of the most important people to talk to are right here in the middle of the room, so you can complain to them later. Okay? So they'll probably tell you that anglers, when they're dissatisfied, they tell their managers about it. And so as a result, the managers go through some stock assessment and they make some decisions. They're more or less responsive to those anglers. Sometimes they blow the anglers off, and sometimes they actually listen to them. And as a result, some stocking happens. Okay, so that's the basic structure of this model. And sure enough, Jake sees that as you put more and more houses on the shoreline, at least in this model, you see that populations go down. The black line here is the wild stock of fish, and he's sort of imagining walleye as his prototypical fish in this study. Eventually, you get to a point where the populations are low enough, the anglers are dissatisfied enough that they're really lobbying hard for stocking, and the managers eventually respond and they start stocking fish, and that sustains a sort of small but fishable population of walleye in the lake. Okay, so some evidence from a fairly reasonable model that this sequence of events can happen. People pull the wood out, that crashes the fish populations, the people get grumpy, they then demand that there be stocking, okay? In some ways that's a good thing. You're sustaining a fishery. If you care about there being a fishery there, that's great. You could think about some of the negative aspects of stocking and what it does to sort of native biodiversity and things like that, and so it's a complicated issue, but it sustains a fishery. There's at least some evidence that this kind of thing actually happens. This is data that Jake pulled together from sort of our focal study system in northern Wisconsin, looking at the likelihood that a particular lake is stocked with walleye as a function of how much lakeshore development there is. And so you can see that as you go up to very high levels of lakeshore development, it becomes really almost certain that those lakes are stocked with walleye, okay? That's not an experiment, it's observational. There's probably 1,000 other things going on underneath that relationship, but it's maybe a little suggestive that some of the mechanisms that Jake imagined actually do happen out in the real world. Okay, so now for the taxes part. One of the cool things that Jake did was to think about, okay, so what does all this mean? This, the fact that the people are sort of damaging the fishery and then the state comes in and saves the day by stocking. What does that mean for the way that tax money moves around? And I'm going to walk you through this figure for a second. So the black line here is revenue to the local municipality. Imagine you have a lake, it's in some town. The town collects property taxes when people build a house on a lake. Often the town collects a lot of property taxes when people build the house on the lake. And so as you go to more and more lakeshore development, at first you have no revenue to the town because there are no houses on the lake. But then you start to get increasing amounts of revenue into the town from the development. And the units here, I should say, are in hundreds of dollars per lake per year. So this right here is $100 per lake per year. Okay, the municipal story is fairly easy to understand. The state one's a little more complicated because the state has a couple things going on. One is that this top line here is sales tax that is generated from the fishery. So Jake used some existing data about, what catch rates produce what kind of spending on, gas and bait and that kind of stuff, and did some math about, okay, well, how much sales tax does that generate? And so you can see that, basically with any level of fishery, the state is collecting some positive amount of sales tax. That takes a little bit of a dip here as the population starts to go down and before the stocking really kicks in. At that point, the fishery is not doing that great. There's not that many fish caught, not that much sales tax collected. Okay, the other line in here for the state is a stocking cost, and that's this line down here. And so you can see at first there's no cost of stocking. Eventually you hit this threshold, and all of a sudden the state is spending a whole lot of money stocking fish. And if you take the sum of the positive sales tax and the negative stocking, here's the net revenue to the state from all that. And so at low housing development, the state is what? Actually, I guess this is the net revenue. They're breaking even, or sorry, they're making money. Eventually, they get to this point where the state is basically dumping money into the local system to sustain this local fishery, right? Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. I mean, the citizens of the state probably have an interest in sustaining that fishery, right? This is a region, our focal region. The economy is entirely driven by water-based recreation, basically fishing and other water-based recreation. And so there's some interest of the citizens of Wisconsin to sort of keep that economy alive, On the other hand, there's some sort of weird externalities going on here, right? Because you could think of it as the people who built the houses destroyed the fishery, the towns collect the money off of that, and the state is coming in to save the day and basically cover the cost for the rest of the citizens of Wisconsin of the fact that the people who built the houses there destroyed the fishery, right? And so this is a first cut bad economic analysis in 15 different ways. But I think it's a really interesting way to start thinking about, okay, well, how are we moving this money around in our societies? Are we supporting the things that we want to support? Is there a more equitable way to internalize some of these externalities, basically, that might be involved in building houses around lakes? Okay, that was good, and Jake should have stopped there. But he doesn't listen to everything I say. So we got talking about this first law of fisheries, and the thing about it is that if you go and look at the empirical evidence for it, there's not actually that much empirical evidence for this thing that is sort of accepted as God's honest truth in inland fisheries. And so we talked about it, and Jake said, well, why don't I go try to test that? And so Jake spent the better part of 2 summers swimming like almost every day, doing snorkel surveys, which sounds idyllic until you realize you're in a wetsuit and it's cold, and it's not as idyllic as it sounds. He swam a lot. He counted a lot of fish. He estimated mortality rates of young-of-year fish across a whole bunch of lakes that had different amounts of wood in them. And what he saw was no relationship. Okay, he gets really pretty good, reasonably well-constrained estimates of the instantaneous mortality rate of young-of-year fishes. In and of itself, that was a pretty cool contribution. That's a hard thing to estimate, and it took an awful lot of swimming to do it. But there's absolutely no significant relationship between that mortality rate and the amount of coarse woody habitat on shoreline. This is focused on juvenile, young-of-year, largemouth bass in particular. That result might not apply to other species. It might not apply in a bigger data set, but it gave us at least a little bit of pause, because a lot of the ideas that we've developed in thinking about this system and that a lot of people use in managing inland fisheries fall back on that idea that woody habitat is really essential for juvenile mortality rates, okay? So this was a surprise for us and something that we're sort of interested in following up on more. Okay. So in that first vignette, I talked about people mostly as sort of like ecosystem engineers, right? They're putting wood in lakes and they're taking wood out and stuff like that. In this vignette, I want to think more about people as anglers, the people who are actually doing the fishing. And I want to think in particular about the information sources that they use in deciding where to go angling. We know that the decision about where to fish is a fairly complex one. This is not data, this is sort of a conceptual model, but it's based on some data work by Fiona Johnson and her colleagues, talking about some of the things that anglers value, so here's their preference for an attribute, or tolerate in deciding where to go fishing, right? So to some extent, anglers value just the experience of fishing. Often they value a high catch rate. They value catching big fish on average, or maybe they value catching at least one really big fish. They tolerate some crowding, or maybe they don't want to tolerate any crowding. They'd rather have solitude and they don't care whether they catch fish. So the decision about where to fish is a fairly complex one. There's multiple parts to the utility of fishing, an economist would say. We're working with an economist now, so occasionally that stuff comes out of my mouth. And different types of anglers might have different combinations of preferences for those different things. Okay, anglers value a lot of different things, but a high catch rate helps. It's nice to catch fish when you go fishing. And so here's some data from Ashley Trudeau and Carolyn Nowicki, who are working with us. This is preliminary stuff just from this summer, but comes from some of the creel survey work they've been doing. So creel survey is where you go out and interview anglers and find out what they're catching and ask them some other questions. And so what you see on the x-axis here is their CPUE, their catch per unit effort, how many fish they caught per hour. And then here is a score of how satisfied they were with their fishing experience, okay? And so you can see that when you're not catching a whole lot, you can be pretty satisfied or you can be pretty dissatisfied, right? You're having a good day, you're having a bad day, the weather was nice, the weather wasn't nice, whatever. But if you catch a lot of fish, you're pretty much always satisfied, okay? High catch rates help. So when they're evaluating this landscape with multiple fishing opportunities, and for instance, in this place in northern Wisconsin where we work, there are 1,000 lakes or so in one of the counties that we focus on, and an awful lot of those are accessible for fishing. So how do you decide where to go? Where's the information come from that you use to make that decision? Well, here are at least some of the sources that you can think about. One is social networks, right? In the old days, that would have been like talking to your friends. That still happens, but also we have other kinds of social networks now too, right? So we're interested both in sort of traditional social networks and also internet-enabled social networks as sources of information. The bait shop is a potential source. You go in, you gotta buy some worms or new hooks or whatever, and you say, hey, I'm new to the area, what's hot right now, where's the good fishing? Increasingly, there are people who use these fishing apps that sort of combine some social network and maybe other information sources to try to give you information about where the fishing might be good at a particular time, and it's a way for you to log your fishing as well. And then often, management agencies will publish information of various kinds about relative abundance of different kinds of species, historic catch rates, things like that. So these are a lot of different kinds of information sources. You might imagine that they have different biases. For instance, does the bait shop ever tell you where the fishing is actually good, or do they send you where the fishing is bad because they want to go to the good spots themselves? You might want to do the same thing about your friends. So different biases, different immediacy, right? So if the DNR is publishing data about what the status of the fishery is, that might be data from 5 years ago, not data from last week or this year, right? Okay, so we've started to dig into this, and our goal is eventually to kind of build up a fairly complete picture of how anglers get information, how that influences their choices, and how that differs between different angler types. For now, I'll show you just a little tidbit of our early data on this, and I'm sorry if the figure's a little fuzzy. So here we have expected catch per unit effort and actual catch per unit effort. So again, this is work from Ashley and Carolyn. And what they did was talk to anglers before they went out and say, hey, what do you expect to catch today? What are you going for? How many do you think you're going to get? And then when possible, they'd get them when they came back as well and say, what did you get? And so we're able to compare their expectations with what they actually caught. And then this is organized here by what their primary source of information was for trying to decide where to go fishing that day. For most people, that primary source of information was just personal experience. Right, I've been fishing here before, or I know the area, something like that. The next most common source of information was friends, and then the store, the bait store, and then other sources. So you can see there's a lot of scatter here between your expectation and your actual catch. You can see that on average, people catch a little less than they expect. And this is based on not a whole lot of data, but you might start to think about some differences in the quality of these different sources of information, right? So when you're relying on your personal experience, your actual catch ends up reasonably close to the one-to-one line. The dashed line here is the one-to-one line. So your expectations are fairly accurate, I guess would be a way to say that. When you rely on your friends, your expectations tend to be a little over-optimistic. And if these patterns hold up, it suggests that relying on the store, the bait store, or other sources of information is a really bad idea, right? That there's no real quality in that information at all. So we're interested in kind of diving into this a little more, and with some more data, starting to think about, okay, who uses what information? How good is that information? How influential is that on where the effort goes in the landscape? Because a fisheries manager will tell you, managing fisheries isn't really about managing fish. It's about managing people. It's about managing effort. Okay, and so we need to know why the effort goes where it does. Okay, another idea that we're really interested in terms of information and how it moves through fisheries is thinking about how catch rates are related to the abundance of fish and what that means for the resilience of these fisheries. So here is a basic idea in fisheries. This is biomass or abundance of fish from a lot to not very many. This is catch per unit effort. So in an hour of fishing or a day of fishing, how many fish do I catch? And in general, we think that those things should be related, right? When there are less fish out there in the lake, you should catch fewer fish with a unit of effort. And we talk about that as the catch per unit effort being proportional to the biomass. By this Q thing here, it's called catchability. It's a proportionality constant. Okay, that relationship is great for a fisheries manager because what it means is that when the fish are really abundant, the anglers are happy, they catch fish, they stay there. As the abundance of fish goes down, the catch per unit effort, the catch rate goes down as well, and the anglers get unhappy, and then they leave. And that's perfect. You want them to go somewhere else, fish some other population, and let this population rebuild for a little while, right? So this is a stabilizing mechanism in the interaction between fish and fishers, right? It's good news. The problem and sort of the monster lurking under the bed for fisheries managers is that that constant may not actually be constant. There's lots of evidence. There's evidence from marine systems and mixed evidence in freshwater systems that catchability can actually change as the abundance of fishes changes. And what that means is that you might get patterns that look more like this. So you have the biomass of fish going down as that population is fished down, but the anglers don't see much change in the catch rates, right? Through a variety of mechanisms, including aggregation to preferred habitat, you can have it be just as easy as it ever was to catch fish, even though the abundance of fish has gone down. And the anglers don't start to see any signal of the fishery being in bad shape until you're way down here at a point where it's sort of hard to rebuild that population. Did I say that in a way that makes sense? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so this happens in marine fisheries. It happens at least sometimes in freshwater fisheries. We were interested in whether it happened in some of the fisheries that we work on. And in particular, we were interested in sort of an experimental, manipulative test of the idea and thinking about whether it could happen as a result of aggregation. One of the other things, this is backstory, but one of the other things that can make this happen is angler sorting. So you might imagine that when the fishing is good, any idiot, even me, could catch fish. As the fishing gets bad, it's not worth my time to go fishing because I can't catch anything anymore. But if you're a good angler, you can still go there and catch fish, right? And so the average CPUE doesn't change. It's just the lousy fishers are out of the system, right? So we've seen that happen in freshwater fisheries. We have controlled for that effect in the experiment that I'm about to talk to you about because we used a constant set of anglers. And so any hyperstability that we see is a result of more of an aggregation mechanism. Okay, so what do we do? We went to Camp Lake. Camp Lake is the dream of limnologists because it's one of these lakes that has two separate basins that are only very barely connected. There's a little tiny channel of water here between these two basins of the lake. And so what we did is each week we went to this smaller basin, which is, I don't know, 5 or 6 hectares, something like that. Estimated the population size of largemouth bass in that bit of the lake. We then sent a fixed set of anglers out to go fishing, and we kept track of their catch per unit effort. And then we would go back and change the population size. And what we would do is catch a whole bunch of fish out of here with electrofishing and then move them over here to like jail for a little while, okay? And we repeated that every week for about 12 weeks or so. Okay, and so what that gives us is a sort of controlled look as we change the abundance of the fish, what happens to the catch rates. We know the abundance, We know the catch rates. Do they change proportionally or not? So here is some data from that experiment. This is work by Colin Dasso. And what you can see is actually quite strong evidence for hyperstability. Okay? At high abundance, you have high catch rates. Those start to come down, but they don't come down as fast as the abundance does, okay, until you get to quite low population sizes, and then you start to see a rapid drop-off in the catch rates. We've done stats on this. That's a significant effect. I can tell you more about it. But it was really cool and I think also a little bit alarming for us that that happens. The positive side of it, I think, is that here's a place where you can imagine that an institution, an agency like the DNR or somebody like that, can actually have a big effect on the fishery dynamics, right? Because fisheries independent data, we call it, so data about the fishery that comes from scientific sampling instead of from anglers, can help to resolve some of this stuff. That gives you a truer picture of what the abundance actually is. And so you might imagine that a management agency could essentially inject information into the system, right? Could have some mechanism for telling the anglers, hey, the population in this lake isn't doing so well. The catch rates look okay, but the population is low, okay? And you might imagine that you could potentially nudge anglers away from the lake using that kind of, seeding of information or increasing the available information in the system, right? So a bad news story, but maybe with an opportunity for some positive management changes to happen as a result of it. Okay, so now I'm gonna speed on to another set of ideas here, and in this last vignette I want to talk to you about, I'm gonna think a lot about governance. So governance is the set of institutions, the set of processes, the set of rules that people use to manage some system and share decision-making power about that system, right? I was just talking about one of the main institutions that's charged with governing this recreational fisheries landscape, and that's the DNR, right? The Department of Natural Resources. That's common. All the states in the US, the provinces in Canada, for the most part, have some agency like that that is charged with taking care of the fish for the people. In our system, and in a fair number of other systems, excuse me, there are other levels of governance as well. And in our system in particular, we're interested in lake associations. So you can imagine these lake associations as a whole bunch of little tiny institutions that exist usually on just one lake. These are way less formal than something like a natural resources management agency. They're volunteer. They don't have any formal power. They have much more limited resources. But we see that they actually do play a pretty significant role in managing the fishery or influencing the fishery. And so I want to talk about some of the ways that that happens. Okay, in our study system, here's one of the counties that we focus on. This is Vilas County on the border of Wisconsin and Michigan. There's somewhere north of 1,000 lakes in the county, and about 10% of them have a lake association. Okay? So the black lakes that are filled in black here are lakes with lake associations. The lakes that are just outlined are lakes without lake associations. So we have a whole lot of lakes. Most of the lakes have public access, and a fairly good chunk of those have a lake association on them. And we know that those lake associations are pretty active. They form for a variety of reasons, but if you go out there and poll them and ask them what their motivations are, this is published work by others, the number one motivation for forming a lake association is protecting the environment and water quality. The number two motivation is maintaining or enhancing fisheries. Okay? So these are groups of volunteers that care about the environmental quality and about the fishery. They have anywhere from sort of insignificant to really quite significant budgets that they spend on a variety of activities. And they take a whole bunch of actions ranging from organizing social events for their members to talking to policymakers to really direct things that are traditional fisheries management activities like stocking fish or improving fish habitat. Okay? So they play a significant role in the set of things that happens on lakes in this system. This is cool in part because it relates to some ideas in sort of the resilience and social ecological systems literature about good ways to manage social ecological systems. So this is work by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues over the years. This is the stuff Elinor won the Nobel Prize for a few years back. And the idea is basically to think about common pool resources, resources that are open to use by anyone, basically. And whether they can be managed without tragedies of the commons, right? The traditional story with common pool resources is, hey, if anybody can graze their sheep on the commons, pretty soon there's no grass left on the commons, right? What Ostrom and her coworkers talked about was, well, actually, in a lot of cases, people who are using common pool resources self-organize. They take collective action to maintain and manage that resource, okay? And Ostrom and her colleagues developed a bunch of sort of rules and patterns about what makes for good collective action, successful collective action, or not so successful collective action. So the cool thing about our system is that we essentially have this laboratory for testing some of those ideas. Almost all the tests of this theory have been from sort of case study and meta-analysis. So someone will go out and say, okay, well, so-and-so studied irrigation systems in Mexico, and so-and-so studied, I don't know, forest management regimes on common property in India. And we can pick out some of the characteristics of those different social-ecological systems and ask whether they match or not with the predictions of this really general theory about how collective action should work. In our case, we have the opportunity to get primary data about hundreds of these individual systems, each of which differs a little bit in terms of the people who are managing it, the biophysical setting, lots of things that supposedly should influence the likelihood for successful collective action. And so the social scientists we're working with are really excited about this as an opportunity to test that general theory using these lake associations as sort of a lab. Okay, I'm not going to talk any more about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about one of the other things that we're interested in about governance, and that is to think about how this collective action, this volunteer work, succeeds or not in this kind of unique setting where the individual systems are networked together and where there's open access, okay? So one of the bits of theory that I alluded to a moment ago was that the success of people in organizing to manage their resource well should be related to sort of their ability to exclude other users, right? So if the system has fairly defined boundaries where you kind of know who the players are and you know where the boundaries of the system are, then it should be possible for a society to organize that manages that system well on their own without government or without property rights. When those boundaries are fuzzier, the theory says it should be a lot harder for successful action to be successful, for collective action to be successful. We have a setting where the boundaries are really fuzzy, right? Anybody can come in and fish on the lake. The lakes are to some extent connected to each other. So can collective action be successful in that setting? And the way I want to think about this is with this cartoon, thinking about, okay, well, here are some anglers who live on a lake. They're part of a lake association on this lake. And they're trying to make a decision about whether they should invest in the quality of that fishery by taking some of their dollars and converting them into fish and then dumping them in the lake, okay? So those anglers face that decision. There are also these roving anglers that can come fish at this lake, or they can decide to go elsewhere, right? And so how does this particular lake association make the decision about whether to invest in their own lake? You can imagine that that's a little bit of a complex decision, because if I, as a person living on this lake, take some of my money and I throw it into the lake in the form of fish, these yahoos here can come and steal my money, right? Like, I'm basically giving my money away to other people. So why would I do that? And an economist looks at this and says, that's not rational. A lake association shouldn't do that in an open access setting. And yet we see that the lake associations do put money into stocking. So what's going on? Okay, so we've been thinking about this with a bit of a model. This, again, is work led by Jake Ziegler. And I'm going to talk you through some of the background of that model. One is that we think about two groups of anglers. One is the residents who live on the lake and form the lake association. The other is the rovers who live elsewhere. one of the key differences between the residents and the rovers is that the residents have low travel costs. If they want to go fishing on this lake, all they have to do is walk down to the dock and drive away in the boat onto the water, right? It's easy to go fishing if you live on the lake. If you're a rover, you have higher travel costs, right? You, at the very least, have to get your boat on the trailer and dump it in the lake before you can go fishing. It might be that you're coming into town from Milwaukee or Chicago and you've got hours and hours of drive to get there, right? So the travel cost to go fishing is a lot higher for these folks. Okay, and we're going to consider two scenarios in this model. One is a scenario in which the lake associations have control over the decision about stocking. Okay? There's no agency doing the stocking, it's just the lake association. And that lake association is trying to make optimal decisions in the model to maximize the utility, the welfare of its constituents, right? The people who live around the lake. They don't care a whit if these people get to catch fish or not. That's not their lookout. They're trying to maximize the happiness of their own constituents over the long term. The other scenario is sort of the more traditional. There's some state agency that does the stocking. And the state agency is, sort of broader thinking about who it wants to make happy, because its constituents include the people who live there on the lake, the residents, and also the rovers who are coming in to fish from elsewhere. Okay? So the state agency is making a similar set of decisions, but with a different set of constituents. Okay, so I'm going to show you some results from this model, and I'm going to get you oriented first. This top panel is going to be the scenario where the state agency is doing the stocking. The bottom panel is where the lake association is doing it. There's going to be a bunch of colors on these figures that are showing how much should the manager, whether it's the state or the local folks, stock to make their constituents as happy as possible over the long run as a function of a couple things. One is the percent of the fishing effort at the lake that is by the residents. So when you're over here, almost all the anglers on the lake are people who live on the lake. When you're over here, almost all the fishing effort on the lake is people who are coming in from elsewhere. The other parameter that we're going to look at here is the marginal willingness to pay for harvest by the rovers. So what this is as a roving angler coming to the lake, I have some willingness to pay. That fish has some value to me. And is that value for one more fish that I might catch relatively low or relatively high? Okay? I'm getting a message that my computer wants to restart. We're going to postpone that. Okay. So here's the scenario for the state agency doing the management. And you can see that the highest rates of stocking happen when most of the effort is rovers, and those rovers value the fish very highly, okay? So the state agency says, look, the rovers are willing to pay a lot for fish. Rovers in general are willing to pay more for fish than the residents, and if we have a lot of rovers, then I should stock a lot, okay? As the willingness to pay goes down, or the proportion of rovers on the lake goes down, then the amount of stocking that should happen goes down as well, okay? That makes sense. There's some stuff that makes sense here, too. This is what happens when the lake association has control of the stocking. Probably the first thing that pops out is that there's way less stocking in general, right? Here the colors go from bright red to blue. Here they go from zero stocking to sort of medium blue, okay? So the lake association, they're not trying to make those roving anglers happy. They're just trying to make themselves happy. The optimal amount of stocking they should do is a lot less, okay? There's almost no responsiveness of the lake association to how much the roving anglers value the fish. Again, they don't care what the roving anglers think. They're just trying to maximize their own happiness. The thing that's surprising here, and the thing that should make you jump out of your seat, and I'm surprised that no one has yet actually, is that they stock at all, right? I mean, these people are throwing away money. Under most situations, there's an exception here when there are very, very few residents fishing on the lake. When the lake is almost entirely dominated by rovers, then okay, well, we're not going to bother putting our money in that lake. But under a wide variety of other conditions, the resident anglers, in trying to maximize only their own happiness, nonetheless stock in this lake and let the roving anglers come in and steal their fish, right? And an economist looks at this and says, that doesn't make any sense. The investments should be dissipated away. What's going on? And we think the key thing that's going on here really is the low access costs. So the residents benefit in this situation because they can get to those fish easily. Yes, it's an open access resource. Any Yahoo, including me, can go fish there, but it's way easier to fish there if you're a resident, okay? And so this differential structure of who pays a lot to get there and who doesn't means that it actually can be rational for a local organization to make an investment in a common pool resource, okay? That's kind of cool. In some ways, it's kind of arcane. It gets economists excited. But again, we see it as a way to think about, okay, well, how might you set up the governance of a system like this to encourage that kind of thing to happen, right? This is a way in which private citizens are basically providing a benefit to anybody who wants to fish in the lake. Not out of their own goodwill. They're doing it with selfish motivations. But you know, it has a broader benefit to society, okay? So how do you encourage that kind of thing to happen and make sure that those lake associations do keep stocking and providing that kind of benefit? Okay. I guess I'm going to say one more thing about that study, which is that Jake also looked a bit at whether there's any empirical support for this crazy model that he put together. And the answer is, yeah, more or less. This is the data. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip across that and mostly walk you through these. I'll start by saying the model isn't perfect. It predicts higher stocking rates, higher absolute stocking rates than what we actually see happening on the landscape, okay? So we have some parameters wrong. It's not perfect. But it gets an awful lot of patterns right. So including the pattern that agency stocking should be greater than lake association stocking, except in some particular cases, that agency stocking should be negatively related to the proportion of residents in the pool, while lake association stocking should be positively related to that. So again, we're sort of encouraged that we're kind of in the ballpark of reality in the way that we're thinking about these dynamics. Okay, so that's the end of the vignettes. I'm going to pause and in like 2 minutes here, try to think a little bit about what that all means. You know, I think we're learning a lot about how this system works by trying to put the social and the ecological pieces together and trying to test some of the sort of untested assumptions in the way that we've usually thought about managing these systems. That's interesting sort of academically. I think it potentially has some real world impact too. We're pretty engaged with the Fisheries Management Agency and with the lake associations up there and trying to basically spread information about what we're learning and get that into best practices in the way that people manage these systems. You know, ultimately, I think the question is how do we, you know, keep away from the invisible collapses and steer ourselves towards the happy rainbows? And I think all that work that I just talked about is a way forward for that. I think it's moving in the right direction. I wanted to close with what I think is really a nice summary of ways to think about managing for resilience in these kinds of social-ecological systems. And this is from a review, a book put together by Wency Biggs and her colleagues a few years back now. And these are cool general principles, I think, and you know, worth putting in the back of your head for any kind of social-ecological system that you might be thinking about or working on. And I'll walk through them just really quickly. So one is to maintain diversity and redundancy. I didn't talk about that much today, but we think about that some in terms of diversity of fish species, right? We see things happening in our fishery and others where there's replacements of one species by another, possibly as a result of climate change or as a result of serial overfishing through time, through generations. So having diversity, having redundancy can help to create resilience in that sort of ecosystem service of fishing. We talked a lot today about connectivity. Connectivity makes social-ecological dynamics complicated. You need to think about that connectivity and you need to manage it. Slow variables and feedbacks. You know, probably one of the biggest ideas in resilience thinking is about slow variables and feedbacks. That kind of came through a little bit in the talk today, but again, thinking about the importance of those underlying drivers and getting the users of the resource aware of those underlying drivers. Getting people to think about these systems as complex and adaptive systems. One of the things we've been working on is talking with anglers, talking with lake associations, getting them to think about some of these complicated dynamics and sort of change their perspective about what the important drivers are and what the things are that they need to worry about. Encourage learning, and I think a lot about adaptive management and experiments and things like that. It's been fun for us to be involved in some experiments with the resource management agency there and try things and get stakeholders involved in that and help people to understand the system better. Broaden participation. I think one of the ways that this system is really impressive is that there's a lot of levels of governance involved in it, and there are a lot of people who become actually very actively engaged with the resource. We were talking about this a little bit actually in a meeting about the Hudson that we had a week ago. That's a good way to build towards resilient outcomes, towards outcomes that you want when you have a lot of people invested in the fishery or invested in the resource and actively engaged in it. And then promote polycentric governance. I don't know if I define that term, but that's governance with multiple levels, lake associations, state agencies, county governments. That's certainly a thing that's happening in this system, and I think we've seen a lot of the benefits of it for getting engagement and letting different levels of government do what they're best at. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I will thank some funding, some collaborators, the Fishscapes team, and I'm happy to take questions for like 10 seconds or whatever we have left. Thanks. Paul.
Chris.
Welcome to Cary, by the way.
Thank you. So there's an old saying in fishing that the fishing was great, but the catching was poor.
Yeah.
So is it possible that a lot of people who fish don't care whether they really catch or not?
Yeah.
And would that matter your paradigm?
Yeah. We see at least some evidence for that. And there's that figure that I showed of satisfaction and catch. And you see that people can be pretty satisfied without catching. People are raising their hands. I can be like that. I would say I went fishing last week for the first time in a long time, and I caught some fish, and I was, oh yeah, this is great, this is fun. The catching makes it better. And I think, it'd be interesting to ask some of the agency folks. We could talk about this over coffee afterwards. I would say that in general, we're managing for catch rates. I guess another way to look at that is that, there's a point at which the fishery essentially becomes unsustainable. You get low enough populations, and there isn't going to be a fishery anymore. And so if you care about having that fishery around, I think you're managing for catch rates, but to some extent you're managing for populations that aren't overfished and that are resilient to external shocks and stuff like that. And the catch rates are one sign of that. Yeah. But I think you're right, and we're sort of interested to sort out, okay, who are those anglers and how do they behave differently than anglers who do care about catch rates, because there are those too. Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, in my experience in Michigan with lake associations, they're also very much preoccupied with weed control.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that the desire to control weeds invasive or not is at cross purposes with optimizing the fish?
Yeah, that's a complex question. In these lakes, there's not a ton of weed control. There's a lot of concern about invasive species. There's not a whole lot of harvesting or pesticides, I can't think of the right word, for herbicides for plants, although that happens. Those plants can be important habitat, and so yeah, it can be at odds. I think the wood thing is a similar story, right? That's habitat. People sometimes want to take it out. There's been some movement towards trying to encourage people to put it in, and now there are actually programs to help encourage people to put it in. So yeah, I don't know. That's not much of an answer to your question. Yes, that's complicated. The lake associations have diverse motives and motives that are sometimes at odds with each other. And I emphasized the motives that are related to fishing, which are important for them, but they're not all that's going on. Yeah. Gary?
So the only management you talked about was stocking. So I'm wondering about whether you looked at the economics of
Yeah. We have not looked at that. We have talked a lot about whether we could ever talk the Resource Management Agency into experiments where we gave the lake associations more control over those things that are traditionally in the realm and the purview of the Resource Management Agency. So imagine that we gave a lake association the ability to set their own creel limits or their own size limits or something like that. What kinds of policy diversification would you see across the landscape? And you might imagine there are some lake associations that kind of blow up their fishery as a result of that. But you might imagine that you could see some innovations and some good innovations come out of that as well. So we're interested in some of those other tools for management. Certainly the agencies play with those levers as well. But in general, in fisheries, in recreational fisheries, we think about things like creel limits and size limits as often being fairly imprecise controls on the thing that we really care about, which is effort. And so really thinking about the effort, how the effort moves around, and whether there are kind of nudges that we can use to move the effort in the right direction is, I think, a promising way to go. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if other people in the room have different opinions. But are you giving me the hook here?
One more, take one more.
Yeah.
Hi. So you guys have done a lot of catch rate. Is your main source of information for that talking to people, like interviews, or is there anybody? You mentioned a couple of fishing apps. Is there any way to access that sort of citizen science data?
Yeah. Yeah, we're talking with somebody about accessing some of that catch rate data from apps. Which in some ways would be really cool. It's sort of it's a new tool in fisheries, and it's a tool that has some biases built into it. And so a lot of the work that's going on that right now is in understanding what those biases are, right? So like, if I'm using an angler app, do I log my trip every time I go? Or am I more likely to log my trip when I catch a whole bunch of big fish, right? So understanding what that data means is, I think, an important first step. But if we can do that, and there are people working on that, then it's potentially a really promising source of data. Yeah, and fisheries management in general, and I think inland fisheries management in particular, is data starved all the time. And so finding ways to get more data is really important. Yeah.
There seems to be a pressing question.
A pressing question.
My question is related to catch rate efficiency. We did not talk about the time. Does time play a role in it? And time could be the amount of time an angler spends waiting to catch a fish and the time of the year. Does that matter?
Yes, it does. Yeah, we know catch rates for particular species go up and down depending on time of year and passage of weather fronts and stuff like that, and whether my left knee aches and some other stuff too. Yes, in some of these experiments, like in that whole lake experiment that I talked about, we tried to control for some of that by having a reference lake that we weren't messing around with, but we were doing the same controlled fishing in. And so we were able to separate, okay, well, when is the catch rate going up or down because of weather or time of year or whatever, and when is it going up or down because we're messing with the abundance of fish? So yeah, that stuff matters, and it's part of what we're thinking about. Did I answer your question? Or? Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Okay.